Hi, everybody. Welcome to Fraction's next peer-to-peer webinar. For those that don't know yet, I'm Nigel Biswas-Baldwin, co-founder of Phraktion. Next slide, perhaps. So just a few short messages from Phraktion, if you don't mind, just to set the scene. So for those that don't know us, we have a grand ambition to try to revolutionise the way work gets done in pharma. And we're achieving that by growing a connected network of fractional experts across Phraktion, one of which you'll see today presents John Lagus. And in doing so, with the access of a large pool of functional expertise, we think we can identify and precisely address core challenges, delivering high impact fractional support. And our clients benefit from this, from a seamless access to our global network of expertise, supporting them to think, take decisive action, and to move forward confidently. So that's setting the scene for Phraktion. Next slide, please. John, we'll go to the real main event for today. So I'll let John do introduction to his presentation, but I should just say a few things about John. So I've known John myself for a few years actually, but just to outline John's experience. So John is founder of the Blue Stem Pharma Consulting, working with pharma and biotechs to better understand and implement best practices for global early access and expanded access programs, meeting patients' unique medical needs. After spending 15 years on the sponsor side, focused on orphan drug development and commercialization, John has spent the next 18 years working for early access service providers, including IDIS, Clinigen, and Turner Pharma Group, where actually John and I met. He has extensive experience with the design, setup, and implementation of more than 200 global early access programs. John is also a regular contributor to Rare Revolution magazine and supports patient groups and those they serve. To his credit, he helps patient communities, and this continues to be John's passion. So hope that was a good introduction, John, but I'll pass over to you for the important piece. Thank you, John.
I appreciate that, Nigel. And just to manage expectations, I've got roughly 10 slides. I'm not going into great depths about how these programs work. It's really touching on some information related to why I think early access is really important and kind of how the story has evolved over time and how companies use it in different ways. My experience with kind of the concept of early access started in roughly 2001. I was with a small pharmaceutical company based in the US. We had brought 6 NCEs to market through FDA, all orphan products, and we were getting lots of requests outside the US. And we happened to come across this company called IDIS, UK-based company that is considered to be the pioneer in the concept of establishing what would be described as named patient programs, early access programs. And as a small company, it was great to be able to help more and more patients. The value that was created for us as a small company, nearly 25 years ago, is we're able to get some meaningful incremental revenue coming from these programs through sales of the product on a named patient basis. But my company was acquired by Jazz Pharmaceuticals in 2005, and in 2006 I joined IDIS to kind of help them set up their US business and to tell more companies about the concept of named patient programs. And back in those days, especially with larger companies that were considering this type of supply, they were very focused on how can we, it's all about helping patients. It's really, we've got clinical trials to generate data, but how can we help more patients, which is admirable in itself. And small companies we were talking to at the time, of course, were interested in that incremental revenue. But I've found it interesting to see how things have changed over the last 20 years. And many of the products that we were dealing with at the time were more in the, I would say, the oncology space. Rare drug development, rare disease drug development was not as kind of sophisticated and developed as it is today. But as companies are developing new therapeutics that are much more targeted, smaller patient populations, the need to have the most effective kind of commercial launch is really important. So companies looking at how can they maximize the value of the asset. And so I think the mindset around how early access it's become, certainly that idea of we need to help patients, but other values that can be created for a pharma or biotech company. So again, having that perspective, looking back 20 years, I find it fascinating, which makes me think about, well, what's it going to be like in 20 years from now about how this space looks. But it really has changed over the last 20 years. Um, so here's a statement. Most people in the world live in countries where access to new orphan drugs will be significantly delayed or never be available through normal regulatory and commercial pathways. Uh, in most countries, I mean, there's what, 215 countries. Certainly that's true. Um, but, and it really highlights the need for the concept of having early access pathways, a way to provide a medicine for a patient with a significant unmet medical need, being able to do that in a compliant fashion for those patients. And you know, it's easy to think about, well, low and middle income countries for sure, they fall into that bucket. But even in, developed territories like Europe, it tends to be the case as well. And want to share some data with you that these data are published by the European Federation of Pharmaceutical Industries and Associations. And they publish annually in concert with IQVIA what's called the patient weight indicator, where WAIT stands for waiting to access innovative therapies. And they look at different categories of medicines. They look at all medicines approved in Europe. They look at just oncology. They look at orphan drugs. They look at non-oncology orphan drugs. And they've been publishing these data since 2004. And the data that you're looking at are the most recent data that they published. So what they look at is in this case, I'm focusing on orphan drugs, but all orphan drugs approved in a 4-year period. So in the 4 years, 2019 to 2022, they conduct the survey in 2023. And by the end of 2023, how many of those products are available in each of these European countries, which go from left to right. And so you can see that there were 63 products approved in Europe. And of course, most of these countries sit under centralized approval, but there are certainly other individual countries like Switzerland, England, et cetera, that fall into this as well. And availability here means full reimbursement through a national reimbursement plan. And so you can see, for instance, in Germany, 56 of the 63 products approved in that time frame are available for patients in Germany. I'd be curious to get Anya's perspective in terms of how things may be changing. But again, this goes back to 2002. Um, you've got France, Italy, still a high percentage, about 70% of the products are available. Moving to the right, England, 28. So less than half of those medicines are available by the end of 2023. Further to the right, it's a couple of the Nordics, Sweden and Finland, about 25%. And moving all the way to the right, you see Lithuania there, one of the 63 products. Lithuania sits under the centralized approval, yet availability is a real challenge. And these data help really speak to the challenge that patients, even in a developed market like Europe, have access challenges and the importance of having alternate access pathways like early access, named patient, etc. Uh, in terms of another cut of the data is looking at time to availability. And so I'll focus again on Germany. So it's the third from the left. And the green dot here represents those 56 products that are available in Germany. And the median time, and they look at both mean and median, but I chose to median for this presentation. I think it's a better representation of describing the data. But the median time to availability of those 56 meds in Germany was 44 days. So high percent of products in Germany available, and the time to availability is relatively quick, given the ability, historically, the ability for companies to set price in Germany. Moving to the right, you can look at England, which I highlighted previously. Again, the 28 uh, products that were available, about 317 days was the median time to availability for those 28 therapeutics. I highlighted France. The uh, I think it was 43 or 45 available. Not surprisingly, given the challenge, the time for pricing reimbursement negotiations in France, but 540 days, 49 days was the median time. And again, if you're a rare disease patient in Lithuania, it was the one product and nearly 3 years for that product to be available in Lithuania. So again, depending on where you live, the number of products are available, and it can take a long time. And again, highlighting the need for early access as part of the overall solution for these patients living in those countries. Here, early access really is an umbrella term. There are other umbrella terms like managed access is a term that some countries use or companies use. Name patient supply, compassionate use. Some nomenclature like expanded access is specific to a regulatory agency like the FDA. But it's the concept that a physician is in, can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Concept that you've got physicians somewhere in the world requesting access for a specific or named patient. Virtually every country has a pathway to do this, and formal legislation exists in U.S., Europe, Australia, Canada. Uh, the kind of a key difference between U.S. and Canada, U.S. and Europe, of course, is that U.S. has got one regulatory agency for 350 million people. The European Commission established certain overall principles of the concept of early access for the member states, but then left it to the member states to establish their own kind of criteria. And so the rules and regulations do vary from country to country. But in most countries of the world, these access mechanisms, especially in the case of orphan drugs, are the only way to access these types of therapeutics.
Hey, John.
Yeah.
Quick question. I'm sorry I came in a little bit late. I might have missed it, but when you talk about availability, do you mean like the drug is approved in that country, or do you mean that it's reimbursed either by the government or by insurance companies? Um, Define when you say availability.
Yeah.
So I guess what I'm asking.
So in the case of Europe, I mean, for instance, if you've got a product that's going through centralized approval, it's approved in all, was it 27 member states? But it has to go through pricing reimbursement negotiations. And when I say available, and the way that EFPIA looks at it is that it's gone through pricing reimbursement negotiations and it's being reimbursed locally in those countries through that process.
Okay.
I can't speak to private insurance how that works in some of those countries, but it's through the national health system, if you will.
Okay. Yeah, that's kind of what I thought. But yeah, thank you.
Yep, absolutely. Any other questions while kind of paused? Okay. So again, concept of early access, patient has a serious or immediately life-threatening disease. In the country where that patient lives, there's no kind of satisfactory alternative to treat that particular disease or condition. And in the case of rare diseases, oftentimes it may be the first therapeutic available to treat that particular disease. Um, you know, Clinical trial is not an option whether the patient doesn't meet the inclusion exclusion criteria or they don't, not in proximity to a trial site. Uh, Thinking about benefit risk, and it kind of comes more often in terms of when the product is globally unlicensed. Thinking about risk benefit profile, but the benefit does, that can be justified to outweigh the potential risks of treatment. And one of the key criteria the FDA looks at, they want to make sure that if the medicines be provided on an expanded access basis, that is not going to impede enrollment into trials that would ultimately help expedite more patients getting it through commercial availability. Just talking briefly about kind of early access in practice. So this was an example of a project that I was overseeing a team while I was at Clinigen, facilitating global EAP for the first medicine to treat spinal muscular atrophy, so SMA. SMA is the number one, you may know, is the number one genetic cause of infant mortality. And any patients diagnosed with type 1 SMA typically don't live past the age of 2. It's actually a great story how much development has been focused on SMA over the last decade. One of the key therapeutics that has come to market has been Novartis's Zolgensma, for instance. But the product that I'm describing here was the first product approved by FDA. The company developing the medicine put the program in place initially just in the U.S. prior to FDA approval, and then once the FDA approval came through, they expanded the program outside of the U.S. The concept of how kind of companies look at that, I did just recently write an article for Rare Evolution, kind of touching on this. So if anybody's interested, have a look at that particular article. But several hundred patients around the world received this medicine via the early access program. And again, later learned that more patients were treated in the global EAP than had been treated in the pivotal studies used to obtain regulatory approvals in both US and Europe. And it was interesting in talking with the company that had developed this, especially the team that had overseen the EAP from the sponsor. They were commenting in a public meeting that they were so thankful to have helped so many patients, clearly, but their one regret was that they had not captured any real world evidence in this setting. And so that was something that I certainly thought a lot about. And at that time, companies maybe weren't as willing to think about, should we or could we be capturing data in this setting? But I will be talking about maybe, how that has evolved in terms of that thinking. So what are some of the benefits of early access for pharma? And again, how's the value proposition change for pharma? Again, previously it was about, 20 years ago, it was about helping patients. But as things have changed with, smaller and smaller patient populations, especially if you're talking about ultra orphan rare diseases, every data point is so valuable. So I would say, it's been interesting to see how in many companies, these programs have been a key tactic in terms of their market access plan. And certainly, one aspect, especially in future commercial markets, by providing the medicine free of charge, it eliminates that barrier and allows as many non-trial clinicians to gain experience with that drug. And again, thinking about first impressions with those clinicians and doing that in such a way that has a positive impact on those clinicians. but also thinking about, especially in the case of chronic medicines, being able to have as many patients, kind of transition to commercial supply upon launch. And so, what can be done to impact that the trajectory of that launch curve certainly is something that some companies are looking at. But EAPs really also represent a key source of real world evidence that has been used in regulatory submissions, HTA submissions, and published literature. I will pause here and just talk briefly about kind of the real world data concept. I mean, it's not to say that it's easy to do. And you have to companies need to realize that they're dealing with very busy clinicians. They don't have a lot of extra time, and so what can be done in such a way to make it as simple working with those physicians? What's the kind of the bare minimum? This is not another clinical trial, but are there meaningful, whether it's outcome data or dosing data or et cetera, that can be captured as part of these programs? And then thinking about how is that data collected? How is that data, do you need to think about um, doing any source document verification and thinking about storage of that data, all important topics as it relates to the data. But there certainly are some good examples of how data have been used coming from early access. Uh, in terms of real world data used in regulatory applications, there are two publications I'm going to reference. This one related to regulatory applications, and then the other to HTA submissions. The same author group looked at both topics, but in this case, the authors employed machine learning to review regulatory approvals from both FDA and EMA. And you can see the years there, searching for terms related to expanded access. And again, safety data, it's companies are obligated to capture safety data. So historically, data coming from early access would normally be included in the safety sections of these dossiers. Um, and it's even possible for, a safety event to end up in the product labeling. But in my experience, regulatory authorities and reviewing agencies are very pragmatic about understanding that sometimes these patients are sicker and they can't necessarily be considered in the same way a safety event coming from controlled clinical trial. However, certainly the safety data is something that is typically captured in these programs. But in this particular case, they were more focused on effectiveness or efficacy data. And they found that real world data coming from EAPs was used to help support clinical efficacy for 39 of the approvals. And in 13 cases, data from these programs formed the main evidence for approval, and um, 6 of those were approved just by the FDA, 2 approved by EMA, and 5 approved by both regulatory agencies. So again, depending on the size of the patient population that you're talking about, real world evidence coming from early access can have a meaningful impact in terms of being able to get products approved from a regulatory perspective. And then this is my last slide. It's really focused more on HTA applications. The authors wanted to look at real world data being used in nice technology appraisals. The authors screened 380 technology appraisals in that 10-year period and found that 206, so 54%, included terms related to expanded/early access. And then 21% of the appraisals, real world data from EAPs were used to support safety. In case of efficacy, it was 47 and resources 52. And their conclusion was that when combined with data from well-controlled clinical trials, real world data collected from EAPs may meaningfully inform NICE decision making. I don't have data saying how many of those were, in terms of the outcomes from a nice perspective. But again, I think it's being thoughtful about the data that you have available from controlled clinical trials, and then how can that be supplanted? And EAPs, I think, is one of those data sources that companies should be thinking about as they look at, um, in terms of helping improve the information. This talk has been probably more European focused, but I think from a U.S. perspective, many of the messages are similar in terms of, for companies to be able to, get more non-trial clinicians involved. I know some of the companies that I've worked with, as they've done commercial launches, to be able to get as many patients onto a chronic medicine prior to, U.S. launch has been very important. And they've seen data capture, even coming from US sites as being very important as part of their overall market access approach. So maybe at this point, I'm going to pause and see if there are specific questions from the audience.
Well, firstly, thanks, John, for a very nice overview. Making the case for early access very well, I believe, John. Thank you. So, any questions from the group? I'm not going to pick on you directly, Kay, but I will come to you if no one has a question. Maybe I have a question then, John. So, just thinking in terms of early access, really, at least in our thinking as we go through the development life cycle, when should we really be thinking about early access? How early is early, do you think?
Well, I mean, in the rare disease space where pivotal could be phase two, it's certainly, I would say during phase two in the case of rare disease. Over time, as I've worked with more and more companies, it's understanding, at what point do you think commercialization could be there? And then if phase three is needed, certainly by the beginning of phase three, thinking about, okay, if we're developing something where we anticipate there, given the unmet medical need, we're going to be getting requests. And how do we want to handle that? I mean, the good thing that it's part of what's called the 21st Century Cures Act in the US. Most companies are required to, or companies are required there, especially if they're doing development trials in the US, to have an expanded access policy on their website. But how, managing, patient communities, whether it's patient groups or patients themselves, at what point might that product be available on an expanded access basis? And it's a little bit longer answer to your question, but if a company is going to do it, do they have budget available to do that? And what are the kind of the key milestones that they're going to want to see? Some companies might say, well, we're not comfortable in terms of priding the product in this fashion until after we see the readout from the pivotal studies. But being thoughtful about planning and saying, okay, we need to be ready at that point because we're going to have a data, a press release talking about that. For some companies, depending on their funding situation, they might say, well, we want to do that after FDA approval when we're assured of being able to have that product launch and having less impact from a funding perspective. So there are lots of different considerations, but historically, starting at that point of when you're starting to initiate your pivotal studies, encouraging clinical and medical teams to start thinking about this needs to be one of those tactics, and actually commercial being involved in market access teams as well, thinking about what are we going to need to from an pricing reimbursement negotiation perspective, or in the US, thinking about helping justify that, through the pricing process, talking about different insurance companies, et cetera. So, yeah, a bit of a winded answer, but hopefully that was clear.
Yeah, so
enough.
I think certainly in my own experience, probably when the pivotal readout has happened, then people rush towards the early access program and kind of
Yes.
thinking, why haven't we been thinking about the last 2 or 3 years in our planning? But there we go.
Yeah, and if the data are strong enough,
Mhm.
like for instance, the FDA is going to come to the sponsor and say, they're you should really be thinking about this. So sometimes companies get caught out on that, and but the reality is companies should be thinking about this earlier in their development cycle. They don't have to do anything, but starting the kind of the planning process and thinking about it, what are those kind of key milestones? And that's going to be driven by, it could be you could have a medic in your company who's very insistent about when they're comfortable about doing that, or it's oftentimes C-suite or medical driven in terms of the thought process.
Well, I think very clear to call John as early as possible in the development cycle, I think. So,
Yeah, indeed.
anyway, any questions? I'm sure there's some questions from, say, Elizabeth. I don't know if there's something in the chat there, so I'll just the chat there for a second. Okay. So, Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to speak to this, Elizabeth, but you'd be interested to get your global perspective on the effect of early access programs on establishing price anchors for later reimbursement negotiations.
Yeah, I mean it's a good discussion, or it's a good consideration, and so I mean certainly in like if you're going to be launching a product in France, you need to be thoughtful about the pricing that you're going to consider, if you're going to use chargeable name patient supply. And because the French authorities will use the name patient price as a reference price as they go through their negotiations, historically, I've always suggested going higher than you anticipate where you're going to come in from your price and reimbursement negotiations. Companies need to understand that they will have to pay a rebate to the French authorities when the pricing reimbursement negotiations have been completed. But it's better than being in that position, knowing that's going to happen, than as opposed to setting the price too low because it and having that price that's going to be the reference price and where you don't want to be there. Certainly, given that the U.S. is oftentimes the first market, oftentimes companies will use the U.S. price early on in their if they're going to be using a chargeable name patient or early access program. Um, and then it just kind of goes from there to determine what the pricing and sometimes the pricing will evolve from a early access perspective because maybe it starts out as the US pricing and then maybe it will evolve to be the lowest price available in Europe because oftentimes the product is going to leak out of Europe. You don't just say it's, I mean, extreme example, Greece. And so maybe it's leaking out of Greece through the supply chain, and you want to be able to control access. So maybe you're using something close to the Greece price or below that price as the name creation price in other markets. So it's a bit of a long answer, but there's lots of different considerations that companies should be carefully thinking about from a pricing perspective in this setting if they're going to be charging for it. Does that help? Good.
So, so that kind of leads to my question, John. Like, what percent of the time are patients charged for a drug in an early access program versus getting the drug for free?
I think historically, certainly larger companies are more apt to provide the medicine for free, especially early on, and where they and particularly in what they describe as future commercial markets. And I don't mean to make this sound harsh, but companies need to be thinking about, if they're going to start providing a medicine to a patient free of charge, what's the exit strategy, especially in countries where they don't intend to commercialize. So oftentimes companies will likely be charging in those situations for patients and even big companies will do that in countries where they know they won't be launching. But in what they would consider kind of future commercial markets, it's likely that the larger companies would be providing free of charge. Um, Small companies, it will really vary in terms of how they would approach that. But and some companies maybe just can't afford to provide it free of charge, and it's going to be chargeable in all markets.
So that really applies before, like maybe while they're waiting for a country to approve reimbursement, right? But like once a country is approved reimbursement, um, is early access kind of off the table, or is that still a possibility? Like let's say it's approved reimbursement, but it's still going to be really expensive for a patient. In some countries that may be more relevant than others, but does that happen?
So once it's been approved, I mean, once it's available, you'll still have this period between, price and reimbursement negotiations approved and then actual commercial availability. So that period is still fair game for providing the medicine. Once the product is available commercially in that
Hmm.
market, then it's, I mean, if we're talking about Europe, it's typically provided through, national health systems, and so it's
So it's
less of an
not going to
issue.
cost the patient an arm and a leg necessarily,
Yeah,
like
yeah,
it might in the U.S.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly. So
yeah,
that becomes less of an issue at that point, but it's the idea of commercial availability. It's not tied to regulatory approval.
yeah.
It's tied to commercial availability in each of those markets.
Thanks. Yeah.
Yep. I saw another question. Let's see. Patient involvement in clinical trial designs is an increasing demand. Do we see patient groups involved in EAP designs? Um, I think, I mean, for instance, because I do a fair bit of work with patient groups, and in terms of EAPs, there's less kind of design issues as opposed to how companies think about, how they maybe stage countries, and how, sometimes, and I referenced this in that example that I gave where, they started out in the US, FDA approval came through, and then they started expanding it kind of in different stages outside the US, somewhat tied to where they were going next commercially. Um, but I'm dealing with a patient group right now, and it's I think more of the activity there is really trying to work with a company to help kind of develop understandings of, kind of what are those milestones and how can they best support from the patient group's perspective, how can they best support and manage expectations of the patients themselves. But I think it's helpful as companies are developing therapeutics and thinking about early access that they are communicating with the patient groups, because the patient groups can be, have that patient voice concept that they can help really manage expectations for patients that those groups are kind of serving, if you will. Any
Maybe,
other questions?
well, John, I was just going to ask, actually, related possibly, diversity in early access programs as well. Is that coming out as an important issue? So it's not just the educated, pushy members of patient groups that get access to early access programs.
Right.
Is there any drive pushers there?
Well, I mean, I would say probably the biggest push came into play with and it was tied to what's called, I referenced it earlier, the 21st Century Cures Act.
Mm.
And one aspect, kind of Congress and FDA were concerned at the time that it shouldn't be about who you know or, in terms of being able to get access to a innovative therapeutic. And so that was one part of that was, companies required to have an expanded access policy on their website. And sometimes that access policy says clinical trials are the only way to get access.
Mm.
But if they're willing to provide access, it gives kind of clear steps of how companies will evaluate those requests. Um, the other thing that FDA and Congress, US Congress did was to require companies that are establishing EAPs to publish those on clinicaltrials.gov. And so if you go on to clinicaltrials.gov, you just put in keyword early expanded access, you'll see hundreds, literally hundreds of expanded access programs. And they wanted to give, um, you know, patients and patient advocates and clinicians as much visibility of what was happening so that if a physician felt like that patient was qualified, they could get access. So I would say there has been some effort, realizing that you don't want this to be about who you know, when it comes to being able to get this type of access. Does that help?
Yes, I think
Is that
so.
clear?
Yeah,
Okay.
absolutely. Okay. Anyway, let's see anything else in the chat. Is there any questions?
Any last questions?
Burning issues? I
Yeah,
didn't really.
and I'm happy to, anybody has further questions, I can drop it in the chat, I guess. It was also on the front page, but
Yeah. You can easily find John in the network as well. So
yeah,
please.
but happy to answer any other questions that people want. This is obviously a very short primer, but something that's been near and dear to my heart. And again, I'm so interested to see how this area evolves over time. And companies really do need to be thinking that about how they can incorporate, and think about value coming from these programs. So thank you so much for joining.
Yeah. And thank you, John, of course. I think again just highlights firstly the importance of early access programs, strategies, and really the sort of knowledge you need to execute upon those strategies. And that's what we try to offer at Phraktion, really high levels of expertise in different parts of the business. And you can quite clearly see that today, on offer through John and across the audience today. So that's really what we're trying to bring out in Phraktion by working together to show that different fractional expertise across the network. So with that, I should thank you all also, and we're back in 2 weeks' time. So look out for the invite for that through Goang very, very, very soon. Okay, see you maybe in 2 weeks. Meanwhile, happy Easter. Bye now.